All right, good evening. Thanks for coming. I think we'll get started with our 20th conversation in this series. And I'm Dietrich Neumann. I'm the director of the John Nichols Brown Center. And as you know, this series has two goals. It brings together artists and architects and thinkers and musicians and writers and with different publics from Providence and for an exchange of ideas and jovial conversation. And also, of course, we try and make this house as open to the public as we possibly can. Our speaker tonight is Kate Kraczon, who is our Director of Exhibitions and the Chief Curator at the Brown Arts Institute, which means she oversees the entire exhibition program at the Bell Gallery and its collection of 7,000, I didn't even know we had that many, 7,000 works of art in the basement mostly, I think, and upstairs.
Mostly upstairs, actually.
Mostly upstairs. And the Cohen Gallery in the Granoff Center. And she came to us 2.5 years ago, has degrees from Oberlin College and the University of Pennsylvania, where she worked as associate curator at the Institute for Contemporary Art from 2008 to 2019. And I think we'll see some of your work there in your presentations. I won't dwell on it too long, but it's a very long string of wonderful exhibitions that you did there, and you'll tell us a little more about it. You also oversaw your institution's 50th birthday, which was a big job, and it reminded me that List Art Center and the Bell Gallery.
We're going to pretend that the birthday is next year.
Oh, good. Because we turned 50 last year in 21, right? We occasionally talked about it. So
yeah, but the pandemic.
The pandemic is a good excuse, of course, because we haven't done anything, but we might, you might pick that up since now you have experience with 50th birthday, so that would be wonderful. So you came in 2019, and since then, first as curator when Joanne Conklin was still the director, and then obviously took over as director. And Kate has already done a lot of work, a string of solo exhibitions with artists such as Savannah Knoop, Jules Gambron, Michelle Cook, and Hartman Dietz. Two-person exhibition with Harry Gold, Harvey IV, and Faith Wilding. That was all last year, and of course right now, and Mary reminded me to put a plug in. Right now, of course, there's the absolutely incredible installation by Lisa Raihana, In Pursuit of Venus, Infected. It's a 70-foot-long video installation that fills the entire gallery. It's absolutely spectacular. And animates a wallpaper, similar in style to ours, different company, Dufour, also a French company. Also woodblock print is a little older, it's like 1804, ours is 34. It's called Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacifique, Native Peoples of the South Pacific. And of course the installation addresses all the issues of colonialism and violence that of course people talk about in conjunction with our wallpaper as well. So it's a really interesting, not coincidence actually, carefully planned coexistence, because Marisa Brown has planned a big exhibition and art installation that responds to our wallpaper as well, which starts here on the 28th. We sort of gave up the last slot in our Thursday series at the end of April for the opening of the art installation here. So this is all going to be great, and we became friends really when Kate joined the Public Art Working Group, which I chaired at the time, and we worked together on getting the Rebecca Warren sculpture installed on the main green and the Solly Witt mural in the new Wellness Dorm, and now you are the chair of this group, and it's in fantastic hands, and I'm very happy about that. And so it's a perfect moment for Kate to assume this position as Director of Exhibitions and Chief Curator, which she did last summer, because the Brown Arts Initiative, as it was called, stopped being just an initiative, which always sounded strangely tentative somehow, and now it's, of course, the Brown Arts Institute, and our Performing Arts Center is about to be finished next year, and Kate is a member of the BAI leadership team and will help build programs around campus with the center and leading up to the opening. And she's also, of course, involved in many aspects of developing the academic program of the BAI. And so I'm very excited and curious to see what you are going to plan and install and exhibit next. So please help me welcome Kate Kraczon.
Yeah. Thank you. So this is my first in-person talk in over 2 years. I'm just used to Zoom at this point, so we're going to see how poor my eyesight is at this point. I printed in 14:15 font. It might need to go up based on podium height. So I want to thank Dietrich and thank all of you for coming tonight. I also want to let everyone know that next week, Avery Willis-Hoffman, our fantastic artistic director of the Brown Arts Institute, is giving a talk here, same time, same place, 6 p.m. And she's going to talk about creating the Brown Arts Institute and developing the new Performing Arts Center in a pandemic. It's been quite a challenge, but she's a really incredible leader, and I feel lucky to be here at Brown under her leadership. So when Dietrich first asked me to participate in this series, which I've attended throughout the past year and have found a really vital way for me to feel part of the community here at Brown, it's been a really lovely Thursday evening ritual. I haven't made all of them, but I've made a lot of them. I initially thought it would require me to present my, quote, curatorial practice, something that I can appreciate in other curators and acknowledge has been an essential element in the professionalization of the field, but one that I tend to avoid myself. I really don't like using practice when I talk about my own work, but I'll use it a lot when I talk about the artist in this presentation. And really, what is a curatorial practice in its basic format, but why I do what I do, where I do it, in a more florid language than I intend to use tonight. What most people, and especially artists, really want to know from contemporary curators is, how do you choose artists? I mean, that's what we get asked all the time. I get emailed every week. I mean, that's the big question. So instead of coming here and wanting to go in depth about a lot of the projects that I've done, I thought I would take a step back and really just talk in a more general way about how I've encountered the artists I've worked with. So not why I like their work, but how I met them, how I first saw their work, the relationships we developed over years, sometimes over a couple of years, sometimes over a decade or two, before we even did a public-facing project together. And so while taste continues to be an under-recognized factor in how curatorial and institutional arts programs are developed, it is a complex and volatile subject that has no place in the convivial Thursday evening programming I think that Dietrich is developing here and has cultivated. And I will instead focus on some of the exhibitions I organized at my previous institution. All the exhibitions I organized here at Brown were in a pandemic. So I'm happy to talk about that in question and answer, and I'm happy to talk about that with all of you over snacks and drinks afterwards, but really I'm focusing on whatever we thought of as a normal pre-pandemic time of creating exhibitions at an institution. And I'm going to depict an array, but not the array, of factors that determine how exhibitions are developed. So rather than talk about why I love this work, I will trace the ways I first encountered these artists and the relationships that developed over time, some more truncated than others. Among the many skills and kinds of knowledge that curators accumulate through museum work is an understanding of institutional identity. It's something that veers towards the ineffable. At the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago and at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania, we would collectively ask ourselves in curatorial meetings, is this an MCA or an ICA show? And by that, we would be gesturing towards the history of the institution, but also the curatorial makeup and interests of the current department, and how this intersected with the history of contemporary art and culture in Chicago or Philadelphia. And a variety of other factors that are more difficult to put language to. Like I said, a lot of it's ineffable. You learn it over time. It's something that I didn't understand fully when I was at the MCA Chicago, but by the time I was fully immersed in the ICA, I started to understand what an ICA show actually meant when our chief curator would pose that question. It wasn't necessarily about whether the artist or thematic exhibition was good or bad, or warranted a show, but whether that exhibition made sense for this institution at this particular moment with this staff of curators. Oops, sorry. My last exhibition at the ICA in 2018, Ree Morton, The Plant That Heals May Also Poison, was the first major retrospective of her work in nearly 40 years. And I know that many of you will not be familiar with Morton or the other artists I reference in this talk, and rather than expand on their artistic practices, which would take the full space of 30 minutes for each of them, I wanted to focus on how I brought their work to ICA and hope that you will look them up on your own or even acquire one of the catalogs that I produce for every one of these shows. They're all available on Amazon, and I've got some extra copies in my office if anyone wants to stop by list. So one of the most common questions I receive about Morton is how I learned about her work in the first place. Sometimes I follow an artist's practice for years, even a decade, before believing it is the right time or the body of work is ready for a show. Other rare times, I'm instantly enamored with a project. And if I like the artist and believe we can work together, that's very, very important. I think that's also under-acknowledged. You want to like the people you're spending years doing very intimate projects with. Then I would maybe invite them right away. And that, again, that would happen in the much rarer cases, but I would at least do several studio visits and have several conversations. And then I would be able to put them on the exhibition schedule quite quickly. This kind of nimbleness that we used to do at ICA and that I'd like to continue with at Bell allowed for both immediate curatorial and cultural responses in our exhibition programs, as well as spaces for long-term, deeply researched projects. Again, this is something that I'm trying to start to develop now that we're moving out of the first couple years of the pandemic, to allow space for these deeply researched, even 5-6 year long-term projects, as well as responsive space on the calendar where you can slot something in. And maybe 2 years, I think 1 year tends to be a little too quick. And for Morton, I tend to meld fact and fantasy in my origin story, that I am certain I knew of her work by the time I was in Chicago in 2004, but that I like to believe I first learned about her work in college at Oberlin, where they have one of her important and rare early sculptures in the collection. And that's pictured, oh, I went too fast, I'm sorry. That's pictured here. So this is the piece that was in the Allen Memorial Art Museum. I lived across the street from the museum when I was in college. I would like to fantasize that this is on view and that Morton was somehow in my subconscious before I really understood what her work was and who she was. But because this is the fantasy origin story I had, I never asked my friend who was the curator of contemporary art there if this was in fact on view in the 4 years I was in college. I would like to pretend it was, and I am not writing about it as if it is the case. It's not referenced in the catalog. It's just the origin story I have. I did know Morton by the time I was working at the MCA Chicago in the mid-aughts. They have a grad school era Morton in their collection, which I wouldn't have registered at the time. And the Art Institute actually has a really important work by hers as well, but that wasn't accessioned until 2011. So I had already left Chicago and moved to Philadelphia by the time the Art Institute acquired this major Morton piece. And certainly reading feminist art history, particularly Lucy Lepard, would have familiarized Morton's name, but I can't trace where I would have seen her first Scholastics in person. And just to explain, Scholastic is a plastic-infused fabric that when a solvent is added becomes really malleable for a short period of time, so usually 20 to 30 minutes. And you can kind of see the fabric like almost plaster-looking material around the edge of this is Scholastic. So it would harden and then we would paint it. So only when Helen Molesworth, the great feminist curator and writer, attempted to initiate a major Morton traveling retrospective in 2008 did her work fully come into focus for me. So Helen sent that exhibition proposal to the ICA Philadelphia, but I don't think she was actually affiliated with an institution at the time. And so while we all loved Rhee's work, it was really expensive to bring Rhee's work. And we can talk about that in the Q&A section if you're curious, but this was the most expensive show, most ambitious show in ICA's history and continues to be at that level. It was quite an undertaking to make this show happen, and it was only possible because we had a major endowed exhibition program given to us in the few years before I mounted the show. And Helen wasn't the only curator to attempt this. I'm often framed as having rediscovered Rhee, and this is false, a kind of patrilineal approach to art history. There are many people over the last several decades who spent as much time and effort bringing her work into greater visibility. Helen is one, as is Sabine Foley, who curated 2 major Morton exhibitions in Europe. Ian Barry at the Tang Museum is another curator who has long championed her work. And we must also acknowledge her estate. Rhee passed away in 1977, particularly Ted Bonin of Alexander and Bonin Gallery for their efforts. Many, many artists were also integral to maintaining Rhee's legacy, like Nayland Blake, even if it was through a smaller, less public network of students and peers. For many years, I was only aware of the Scholastic work, and it was through research into the ICA's 50th anniversary exhibition in 2013 that I learned about an installation she did for ICA in 1973 called Sister Perpetua's Lie. This is pictured here, and that she spent much of her short artistic career in Philadelphia. So this is Sister Perpetua's Lie in 1973 before she discovered Scholastic at the old ICA space. And this is Sister Perpetua's Lie, the most ambitious piece to bring from Europe for this retrospective. And this is it installed at the ICA in 2018. Ree was also included in 4 other exhibitions at ICA, including a 35th anniversary exhibition pictured here that only featured 5 artists and was curated by Judith Tannenbaum, who many of you might know from being the contemporary curator at RISD's museum for many years. And here's one of those pieces Judith curated, just a close-up of it in the retrospective at ICA in 2018. I initially wanted to bring Sabine Foley's 2015 Reina Sofia Madrid exhibition to Philadelphia. When the Reina Sofia did not want to tour the show because, again, the loans were really difficult to gather and tour, Ingrid Schaffner, our chief curator at ICA, encouraged me to curate the first US retrospective in over 40 years on my own. And I just want to make a side note about first, because I'll use first a lot in this talk. This term is often used to create enthusiasm and exclusivity around exhibitions, particularly with funders and board members, but it also does participate in a kind of colonial framework of conquest and claiming, particularly when applied to artists outside of the USA. So it's something that's part of the lexicon of the art world that I think we should get away with, but it also does still signal, you know, this was the first opportunity you had to see these works collected in over 40 years in the United States. So I began the Morton Project when I was 35, and I was intimidated by all of the curators, these incredible feminist curators, decades older, who had staked a claim on Morton, feeling undeserving to shepherd this important show. But often these are the necessary exhibitions we must pursue, and the artists who remain under-recognized or overlooked, often unknown by board members and funders, critics and the public, whose work is undervalued by the market. It's why I've remained at a university art gallery to allow space and freedom to work on projects that recalibrate the art historical record. This is also why I curate women, trans, gender nonconforming and non-binary, Black, Indigenous, and POC artists, and why this moment of crisis in the museum field over the last 2 years, and it is a crisis, is revealing how inclusive institutions are and are not beyond public-facing rhetoric. And as an endnote on this project, Ree's Signs of Love, the big installation on the left, has now been on view at the Whitney for several years. So this is something that had traveled elsewhere on occasion. I saw it in Vienna, was the last time it had been on view, I think in 2017, maybe 2016. And the Whitney hadn't shown it since they acquired it. So because of the Ree Morton show at ICA and all of the reviews and the wonderful press we got, this is the type of thing you pressure the big institutions to start putting this work in their collections on view. And because of the pandemic, it's actually been on view for, I think, 2 more years than they intended. So, and I keep seeing the research I have on Instagram tagging this. I think it still might be up if anyone wants to check it out in New York. So I'm going to rewind a little to 2013 and a project I did with Carla Black, a Scottish artist whose work I just wanted to throw an exhibition in here where I couldn't remember where I first saw the artist, right? So the Ree has the origin story. I was like, oh, I had to have seen it at Oberlin. Carla, I don't know. I saw it somewhere in Europe, possibly in 2009, and I suggested her for a small ICA project space show in 2010, and that would have been a show in a gallery even smaller than the room we're in now. And at that time, the project space shows did not allow for artist travel and shipping beyond the northeastern United States. So in 2011, she had this fantastic Venice Pavilion exhibition. I don't know if anyone saw this Venice Biennale at the time, but it received, this particular installation received a lot of attention. And again, the wonderful Ingrid Schaffner, who I learned so much from, came back from Venice and knew I loved Carla's work and said, let's ask her to do a big installation in one of our big spaces. And that would be her first in the United States. So her desire to not travel became an issue as I organized this show. Believe it or not, she's not the first artist I've worked with who doesn't fly, but who does work across different continents. So I was looking into ship tickets to get her from Glasgow. She did end up flying because of her schedule at the last minute. But I went to Glasgow to meet her because she did not want to fly to ICA to see the space in person if she didn't have to. She wanted to come for the installation. So I went to Glasgow in person. Something I think is essential to working with artists on newly commissioned projects, and we can talk later about the globalization of the art world and carbon footprints, because that is also an issue. But I do believe when you're doing major commission works, I don't want to, my colleague Jessica and I, you have to see the work in person. You can't rely on pictures. You have to develop a really intimate relationship with the artist, and one based on trust. And I think that Zoom is wonderful, but it's lacking, and I really believe in seeing work and being with artists in their studios in person, and that means a lot of travel. So while she was not able to come to ICA in advance, she did create this incredible installation based on floor plans and photos that I shared with her. I encourage artists to think about unusual heights or windows in gallery spaces as opportunities rather than issues. And one of the more exciting spaces the BAI will have to work with is our 5,000 square foot flat configuration for the new Performing Arts Center and its multi-story sightlines for viewers. So not only do we have this massive space to play with and do installations with artists, we also have these multiple levels of seating where you can see the work. So we're thinking a lot about the Guggenheim Rotunda and some other spaces that allow for a really creative way of sightlines working in a large space. This is one of four. Sorry, I keep looking at Jessica. One of four configurations. I encourage you all to go to the architect's website to see this in animated form, and you can see the space change and move and adapt to orchestra, black box. It's a really wonderful opportunity for Brown to be able to adapt to what artists need from us as the Brown Arts Institute. And everyone on campus, it's not just for internationally touring productions, it's really meant to be a space that can be harnessed by students, staff, and faculty, but also we're going to be doing world-class artistic presentations as well. So after our little aside into the Performing Arts Center, which Avery will talk about more next week, I just wanted to point out that I encouraged Carla to utilize the natural light from the skylights in our second floor galleries. You can see this image on the left. It's a little warped to capture the height, but that's a really high ceiling, and I opened up the skylights for the first time at that point in 6 years, I think, since 2009. They had just been closed. Obviously, light conditions are an issue for a lot of different types of artworks, but I liked to play and open those up whenever I curated in this space because the work changes over time. And Carla recognized this immediately, and we talked about it. And so because of this feature, the light in the space changed throughout the day and throughout the season, and the shadow of her title was explicit as the work spread into the low ceilinged half of the gallery. So you can see that the work is practically in shadow, as the title suggests. This remains the only exhibition I've curated where the artist was invited to create a project without me having met them in person first. So we contacted Carla. I felt nervous about it. Ingrid said to go ahead. This is how you have to work sometimes. And then I went to Glasgow after she said yes. So that was the order. And that's not super usual for me, but that's how this worked. But it was also years of following her work. So I had been following Carla's work for half of a decade at that point, quite closely. The next exhibition I want to jump to is from 2015, one I organized with Ruan Abou-Rameh and Basil Abbas, which included a working group across Penn's campus with graduate students and faculty and researchers that helped develop the third chapter of their three-part Incidental Insurgents project. It's another example of how spaces like the ICA and the Bell BAI elevate practices of underknown and under-recognized artists nationally and internationally. And at the ICA, I showed parts 1 and 2, while part 3, which we developed in the working group again, won the Sharjah Biennial Prize that year. And then the entire project is now in MoMA's collection, which is always really exciting, and how you want the work to create also funding sources for the artists, but it's incredibly exciting when it goes to an institution like MoMA. And there's some other projects I've done that I'll mention in here that went to major collecting institutions because, again, it becomes part of the canon, part of the historical record, and part of a recalibration around how art history has been developed, contemporary art history over the past 50 years. So these are images of the ICA presentation. I first encountered the work at the Istanbul Biennial in 2013. This is one of those rare moments that I referenced previously where you are instantly enamored, confused, curious, a little obsessed by the artists you had previously not been aware of. I walked into their installation in Istanbul and wanted to know more, wanted to meet them, and to gain a better understanding of the work. I am not the only curator who is compelled by the not knowing or understanding around a particular practice and by the desire to not fully comprehend, but to spend more time with the work. And in that way, curating can veer into a kind of selfish desire to live with work you seek to more fully understand. So one of the wonderful things at ICA is that we were, our director didn't love this, but we were always late on our catalogs, which meant sometimes I got to write my curatorial essays after the show was installed and after I got to live with the work for at least a couple weeks, because so often when you see these incredible catalogs that are ready the week before the exhibition opens, the curator sometimes has never seen the work in person. They're writing about something that has been conveyed to them in emails or conversations or maybe some images, but they actually haven't seen the artwork and they're writing the curatorial essay of note in that particular exhibition. I don't know what a happy medium is. I prefer to write about work that I've lived with and that I've seen and experienced, but that also diminishes catalog sales, and people always want the catalog, in the first month that the exhibition opens. I also want to mention that we had an opening on our schedule at ICA in a little over a year, and after meeting Ruan and Basel in their New York studio, they had just happened to move there a couple months before I saw their work in Istanbul. We instantly connected. I mean, truly just an instant connection with artists. It's my favorite type of connection. It's the one that generates more projects over time rather than just an instantaneous, maybe like terminal exhibition schedule. So we instantly connected and realized that Penn and ICA would be an ideal first exhibition for them and site for this project in the United States. Again, first in the United States, I can't get away from that. And I'm still obsessed with Ruan and Basel's work as it evolves. They are now in the final stages of a major joint exhibition project across DIA and MoMA. And the latter opens later this month, so at the end of March, MoMA opens a big exhibition that's been on hold because of the pandemic, but I encourage you all to check that out. And as they shift their focus and start to engage with Brown, this first moment will be a talk at Brown's Center for Middle Eastern Studies on April 26th as part of the Gender and Body Politics, Art in the Middle East and its Diasporas, a project organized across Brown and Columbia. So working with Nadia in the Center for Middle Eastern Studies here from Brown, it was just a really wonderful, Brown has a Palestinian Studies, I think it's technically a concentration, a program. I don't know all the right terminology, but it just seemed like an incredible opportunity to match these artists with the faculty and research that's being done at the center. And Nadia was already working with a colleague at Columbia on this project that seemed like a perfect opportunity to start Basel and Ruan's process of getting to know faculty, landing here at Brown. I think physically they're going to do the talk from London because they're installing there in April, but we will start to bring them to campus more often. This is the first of many moments of engagement with Ruan and Basel that we're planning here over the next 5 years. The Brown Arts Institute is uniquely positioned to provide these opportunities for artists with expansive transdisciplinary practices that are not limited to common temporal and architectural exhibition models. And by this I mean I already did an exhibition and a catalog with Ruan and Basel. The exhibition was up for 3 months. The catalog was published during the run of the exhibition. And now I'm interested in meeting artists who are so expansive in their thinking about their practices and the mediums they work in. And I do think that the BAI, as we develop the multiple programs and platforms there, is going to provide ways of working with artists that I haven't been able to do at past institutions that are limited by, well, if you want to work with an artist, fall 2024 is available and that's it. Whereas at the BAI, Ruan and Basel might come and do a form of publishing, performance, recording, and record distribution. There's a recording studio in Granoff. Installation, web-based projects is something they're interested in, and of course, actual academic research and working with students is something we're really prioritizing as too. Another artist who I worked with previously and I'm bringing to Brown for a more expansive engagement is the feminist experimental filmmaker Elizabeth Subrin. I saw Elizabeth's work in 2010 at a gallery in New York and began doing regular studio visits with her. Though she's based in Brooklyn, she is a faculty member at Temple and a presence in Philadelphia. In 2013, I invited her to think about how she could create a project for the ICA's 50th anniversary exhibition, which invited all 5 ICA curators and any interested staff, which I loved, to choose an exhibition from ICA's history and invite an artist to respond. So we actually did 50 projects it was 3 or 4 months. It was a lot, but it was a wonderful response. And it's why I was laughing when we talked about the 50th anniversary list. I'm not quite there to 50 projects in 3 months, but maybe, yeah, it was a really wonderful idea. Again, Ingrid Schaffner brought it to the table for us to consider. Really great curator who did the most recent Carnegie International in Pittsburgh. Because film production is expensive and requires many, many years of planning, Elizabeth and I decided we would work on a large film project in the future, which is now happening here. And instead, IC 850 gave her an opportunity to experiment with sculpture for the first time. And this is something I think that Kunsthalles or non-collecting art programs should really prioritize, is allowing artists to get outside of their comfort level and not necessarily have to reproduce the same types of projects that they're often asked to reproduce. So we worked with a glass artist to create these vitrines that etched registrarial notes from the ICA's 1989 Francesca Woodman exhibition. Woodman was a RISD graduate in photography who is widely known but no longer living. And Elizabeth had made a film about Woodman in 2000. In 1989, the ICA registrar referred to these documents as damage reports, though I strongly prefer the more contemporary condition reports. That's what we use at the Bell and ICA at this point. And given Francesca's work, its problematic interpretation by critics, and her death by suicide, Elizabeth was fascinated by the language used to describe the condition of the photographs as they arrived at ICA in 1989. So Francesca had already passed away, and some of this language, it says, curling inward slightly. And if you know Francesca's work, that's a really kind of incredible note for the registrar to make. And this one says, foreign matter under print causing bump. So there was a very bodily way that the registrar was talking about this work, and in the quote damage reports, and Elizabeth wanted to mark that and make this another chapter in her work on Francesca. So Elizabeth has just returned from shooting in Paris with 3 incredible and increasingly known French and American actresses, preparing for an installation project that will open at the Bell in January of next year, and then travel to New York and France. Fingers crossed for France. The BAI has provided a significant portion of the funding for the stage of the film project, which will evolve to a feature-length narrative in several years. I don't know what Elizabeth would be comfortable with me sharing publicly. I didn't want to say too much, but the footage that she is producing for the Bell will be deployed as a multi-channel installation, another immersive installation, and ultimately embedded as a form of documentary footage in the final film. So this is another example of how I see spaces like the Bell is providing opportunities for more formalized final projects, as well as experimental stages in long-term projects over time. So while Elizabeth continues to live between New York and Philadelphia, I do want to shift to a few of the Philadelphia-based artist projects I produced at ICA. This is absolutely central to what I believe the mission of the ICA and Bell and BAI are. To roughly quote the incredible curator Hamza Walker regarding his decades at the Renaissance Society in Chicago, quote, "Our goal is to bring some of the best artists in the world to Chicago and to bring some of the best artists in Chicago to the world." So it acts as a kind of funnel out into the world, but also a funnel in. And I really love that model in thinking about spaces, contemporary art spaces, especially at universities. And the platform of the Bell and Brown Arts Institute, as we increasingly gain a national and international presence, will give visibility opportunities to the rich artistic communities in the Providence region. And now that the pandemic is hopefully waning, you'll see me out a lot more than I have been for the past 2 years, as I think a lot of us landed during a period where we were working from home and nothing was open and the events weren't happening. So I'm really excited to get to know Providence and this entire region in the way that I did Philadelphia. So in Philadelphia, this often meant working with emerging artists on their first solo museum exhibitions, or in the case of Alex DeCorta and Jason Musson, inviting these longtime friends and rising art stars to create an exhibition that focused on what I saw as their individual strengths. Alex as a video artist and Jason as a gifted writer. What emerged is the major multimedia installation, Eastern Sports, pictured here. And when I arrived in Philadelphia in 2008, Alex had just returned from his MFA program at Yale. I knew of his work and had met him at various openings and events around the city. He was obviously very talented, but it was his first video, the first video he ever made, submitted to ICA's yearly Open Video Call exhibition, that inspired me to push him in this direction. So I loved the objects and the photos he was doing, but the video, I was so excited by the video. That's really what I zeroed in on as a curator. He also did this really interesting project in 2011 across 2 artist-run spaces in Philadelphia. This is at the ICA, so this is me asking him to kind of revisit and rethink this project. So I invited him in 2012 to rethink and use other artists' work as installation material. So that's what fascinated me, is he had borrowed or even purchased work by other artists, including mentors and peers, and embedded that work in the installation, sometimes coating it in a new material that could later be removed. I know some artists weren't happy about that for the ICA show I did with him, and this is one side, black and white on one side and color on the other. This is an actual Paul Tech sitting on this vitrine. That's an Anna Betby's wall piece folded up inside the vitrine that looks like a shaggy rug. So there's real artist work that he borrowed, that we got loan agreements from and borrowed. I got the estate's permission for Paul Tech. Alex also included older work of his. And then we got permission from artists like Karen Kalimnik and Polly Affelbaum to make kind of fake reproductions of their work to include in the exhibition. So, and the wall label outlined this. There was no hiding what was an actual artwork and what was a reproduction, but the label became part of the piece. It wasn't just, the object information, it actually became the conceptual framework for what Alex was doing in the gallery. And then Jason is someone who I also met around town after first moving to Philadelphia. We shared friends, and he was an MFA student at Penn when we did our first initial studio visits. I was also an avid reader of his Too Black for BET column, and of course a fan of Hennessy Youngman, his alter ego, that you can still look up those YouTube videos. As these 2 artists gained gallery representation and began selling, and they were really successful selling out of galleries in New York and elsewhere, I saw their work shift to object-based practices and wanted to offer them an opportunity to make work that moved back into video, language, and installation. Though this project is now in the collection of the Whitney and also the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and Alex has gone on to make major video installations at the Venice Biennale and Carnegie International. And most recently, if any of you saw the Rooftop Met installation last summer, it was really fantastic. No video, but you see the influence. The intention for this project was not only to give a platform for these 2 Philadelphia-based artists, but also one that's outside the constraints of the art market, and that's something else we can talk about in Q&A. I really think that's what we should be focusing on in these spaces, is allowing artists to step outside that pressure to create things that need to sell and just really do what they want to do. Just say, what's your dream? What's your dream project? What's your dream budget? And then try to work within that, because obviously you can't do everything. I always reference Jeff Koons's proposal. So instead of the Millennium Park Bean in Chicago, his proposal for that project was some type of roller coaster ride where people would strap in, and of course insurance, and you can imagine having a Jeff Koons actual ride. This was maybe a myth in Chicago when I was there, but I swear I heard it at from a pretty accurate source. So my last exhibition I'm going to talk about tonight is Philadelphia-based artist Becky Suss. Becky, this is the exhibition at ICA that we did. Becky had been at Berkeley's MFA program for the first 3 years in Philadelphia that I was there. So funny aside story, the artist that I was matched to work with, Anthony Campuzano, at ICA when I first got there, he invited me to his girlfriend's going away party because she was going to grad school. Now, Becky was the other girlfriend, another friend's girlfriend at going away party. That was just so confusing. So 2 women were going away to grad school, and I was invited to the going away party. So I met Becky her last night in Philadelphia, and then she went away for 3 years. And then when she came back, I saw her work in some of the artist-run spaces around Philadelphia. Again, artist-run space is so important, I think, to the art ecosystem. Really excited to get to know the spaces in Providence and Boston. And the first time I saw Becky's work was at Space 1026, which some of you might know. It's still running. It's been around for over 20 years. and had done a lot of exchange, was started by a bunch of RISD grads, and did a lot of exchanges with artist-run spaces here. So I saw a Dirt Palace show back in, I think, 2010, down in Philadelphia. So I was already a little familiar with what was happening in Providence because of Space 1026. And then I loved the work in the 1026 show, and I loved the direction she was going, but it wasn't until I saw this large canvas at Vox Populi, another long-term artist-run space and collective in Philadelphia, and just knew that now is the time to do her first museum show. So we had a space on the calendar a year away, and I knew that that was a really tight turnaround because she works in acrylic, but it's still a very time-consuming process to make these really massive canvases and to even, develop, not even just paint, but to develop ideas for them. Also turns out that Becky was getting married the weekend after the ICA exhibition opened. So she was a little hesitant when I first approached her about that timeline, but she did end up agreeing. She agreed that now is the time and that we didn't actually have any more exhibition space for another 2 years. So we would to wait a full 3 years before we could do a show together. So it was like, this is the time, your practice is ready for it. And also I'll get to the financial side of it, because I have a little spiel at the end. But it was also about supporting, I'll just get to that. It was also about supporting her financially. So the goal is not to get gallery representations for artists I work with. Some already have it, but most don't. But I do care that the artists I support have financial support. While I have had the privilege of working with artists whose work I love as the primary factor and why we create an exhibition project together, I rarely have had to worry about funding at the ICA. I was given a budget, and I wasn't told you can only work with an artist that you can fundraise X amount of money with. Or truthfully, some institutions say you can only work with an artist who already has a gallery, who can give a certain amount of financial support towards the exhibition. Very lucky that that was not the case at ICA, and that has not been the case here at Brown. It's why I'm here. I love being in university galleries for that reason. And I want to note that as I end this presentation, all of these exhibitions included artist honorariums and production budgets. So for Becky, there was an honorarium, and then there was also money to support how expensive it is to get canvases like this made and how expensive acrylic, yes, not oil, but acrylic paint is. I also pressured her gallery to give her extra money because I knew that they were going to be able to make some sales out of this show. She had a Philadelphia-based gallery at the time that I think she still works with. I also worked with ICA to become the first museum in the world to be certified by the nonprofit WAGE, which is an acronym for Working Artists in the Greater Economy. Here at Brown, in many cases, I think for all of the projects I've worked on, we've actually exceeded WAGE standards in terms of how we pay artists. And as we continue to work with emerging and under-recognized artists. And for some, this is still not enough to recoup the labor and materials, because artists always put in more labor and always put in more their own financial, their own finances into projects. You can't control that. I mean, we can go back and I can talk about who used the budget I gave them and who added thousands of dollars to it because they had a vision that they wanted to achieve. And I always want artists to use their honorariums for rent and student loans and food and gas and all of those things, but a lot of them will just put it back into the work, and once you give people checks, you can't control that. And I also want to add that over the last decade, I've been told several times by artists who've come back to me after working at ICA, and I expect after working here at the BAI, that this was the best support that they've received in their careers. And that because they were early in their careers, they didn't realize that having a production budget and having an honorarium, even though those are increasingly common, thank goodness, we still were setting a bar that was not being met by a lot of other institutions. So that's something that I think we continue to normalize, and it's something we talk a lot about at BAI. It's an evolving conversation, and one we're centering as we grow and seek to support the arts communities in the region, because that will remain the most important element of what we do. And so that's just as you all get to know us, and I keep looking at my colleague, my BA colleague Jessica, but as you get to know us, you know, that's the way we're centering conversations. This isn't about bringing people from all over the world to Providence. It's about also bringing up arts and artists and makers and arts workers. There's so many things that we can't talk about yet, but that's what's being centered here at the BAI. And maybe Avery will be able to reveal a little bit more next week, so I encourage you all to come back for her conversation. Thanks. So, questions? Sure.
I have a question about timeline and how long specifically the Bell Gallery it would take to show. So, like, for example, if you could say, like with the Lisa Rihanna right now, when that process begin?
Well, again, we're in the pandemic, so nothing is in a normal timeline. Lisa Rihanna was meant to happen in fall 2020 alongside the Inheritance Conference that's happening here at JNBC. And obviously we had to push it forward. And it just became a moment when it made sense for our schedule, and I obviously checked with Dietrich and Marissa to make sure that it worked for the Inheritance schedule too. We all crossed our fingers and hoped that by the end of April, people would be able to be in a hybrid model. So we're gonna have a big, you know, party, when I say party, who knows how much of a party it's gonna be, but a big celebration at the Bell. Instead of an opening in January or February when we were still masked and not able to have food and drink. So I will say normally the Lisa Rihanna exhibition was not commissioned by the Bell. That's a piece that has existed since 2015 and then an updated iteration in 2017 at the Venice Biennale. So that's much easier to bring. It's the commissioning new projects that takes time and labor and money. So it's really easy to go out into the world and go to other exhibitions and I don't want to use the word shop because that's not what curating is, but to say, oh, I like this, let's pay the exhibition fee and bring it here. And the closest I've come to that is the Rouen in Basel, right? But we did a working group over many weekends with dozens of people across campus to do research and actually talks and presentations to kind of develop part 3 of that project. And we also did a catalog, right? So if you're taking an exhibition, the project already existed, but it had never been outside. At that point when I saw it, it had never been outside of, it had never been in a museum. It was at the Istanbul Biennial. And then it went to the Sao Paulo Biennial, right before it came to the ICA, but no one had done a catalog. So that was like another contribution that's expensive. Catalog programs are really expensive when you do them correctly with really good design where everyone's paid for their labor. So that's something I'd like to develop here at the Bell too, but I'm hesitant to do that until we have a publication coordinator and the budgets that would allow that to happen. So I can gesture to the future and say that there's a spring 2024 exhibition that I'm working on with an artist based in Paris and an institution in France and a curator there. We've been talking about doing this show for years, and it's an artist whose work I've followed for years. So, you know, it's not a 2-year timeline, but we're at the point where we're going to start fundraising and applying for grants. And then it's not a research-based project, so I don't need a research grant to do years of research and travel around. The artist is going to produce new work for the Bell and for this French institution. I can't say more about that, but that's the minimum timeline. But this is also really, like, I know the artist, I've met them, I've seen their work installed in Europe, so if that gives you a better idea of like the absolute shortest 2 years. Under that, like, really brings me anxiety. So, and I've done that this year a couple times, but we're hoping to get away from that now that things are opening up and moving a little more smoothly.
I'm curious about like how the process of working with an artist starts. So like initiating a conversation and like thinking about ideas, like how much input do you have, or does the institution have in the process?
That's such a great question, and I will say curators are different. I'm a very hands-on curator. I think I kind of elaborated a little bit on some of these projects where I said, I want you to I want us to open the skylights and I want you to make a work that goes up 30 feet into the sky. Or here at Brown, there have already been moments where, I've reached out to artists and said, there's this archive here. Let's work with this archive. Or there's a faculty member here whose research really intersects with what you're doing. Let's try to bring them into the conversation. Or if the work is going in a direction that I'm not particularly excited about, I'll nudge it in a different direction. But there are also curators who just are like, make some work and I'll come decide what I want to put in. See you in 2 years, or see you in a year. I know that those situations exist too. For me, I'm very hands-on, and that's just the institutional culture that I came up in too. Yeah, but I don't believe that curators are artists. Like that wave of like the curator as creator, that's something I really want to push against, and I think my generation came after that 90s and early 2000s way of thinking about it. Our job is to make artists' work look as incredible as possible and to put language to it that is accessible to the publics that come into our spaces. That's at the bottom line, that's your job.
I was very impressed to see those spaces at the ICA. They're quite large and magnificent, and obviously you worked there for 6-7 years, right? And I expect you bring a lot of experience to our place, which is so different in many ways. I wonder if you could just, you mentioned a few of the things that you sort of started there and that you're bringing here, but if you could, in a nutshell, say what is perhaps the most important thing that you learned there that you will or are in the process of applying here?
Oh, that's a really great question. To understand whether or not artists can scale up. Mm-hmm. Because and this is one of those ineffable things that you just learn, right? You can tell if an artist's practice is ready to make that jump to a solo show, or whether they're going to panic and not be able to produce enough work, or maybe they don't have the finances to produce enough work, and you have to figure out how to get them money far enough in advance where they can buy and have stretched these large canvases and make sure that they have enough paint, because artists don't have $5,000 to $10,000, so that some of them get credit cards out to get materials in advance. It's something that, again, another conversation we're having at BAI is to make sure that we can get the production funds to artists years before the project, so that they're not taking out credit cards and charging it, racking up interest, and then the fiscal year that it happens in, they suddenly get a big check from us. So these are the things that we're trying to think through collectively, and make sure we're not putting that type of financial burden on artists. So that's my answer. So for the Bell, it's a great size space for an artist's first solo exhibition. It really is. It's pretty small for a group exhibition, I will say, if that's the only space you're working with. I think it's hard to create an argument or a narrative for a thematic exhibition in smaller spaces. The Cohen Gallery, which is 800 square feet, is challenging because it's a wall of windows, and a lot of light conditions prohibit certain works from being shown, like photography, for instance, depending on the artist's comfort level. It's also not a security monitored space, right? There's not someone in the space making sure people don't touch the work, so that's another factor that we have to think about, though it is temperature and humidity controlled. And then when we're talking about the flat configuration of the new Performing Arts Center, which is 5,000 square feet. I mean, you can't take an artist who's never had a solo show, even as big as a room like this, or even in a room like this, and then ask them to create enough work for 5,000 square feet. It's something I talk about with colleagues all the time, especially funders. Foundations are always getting these applications from museums and arts institutions that are like, there's this emerging artist, he's never had a show before, and we're gonna do this $1 million public art work with him, right? He doesn't have studio assistants, doesn't have a staff. The artists that do those big public artworks have done major projects before and have staff. They have studio managers. They can, we wanna think about ways we can get artists to that point, but you can't set people up for failure. And space is a big part of that, and budget is a big part of that too. Yeah. That's the first answer that comes to mind.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, I have 3 quick announce before I thank Kate, our speaker. I wanted to obviously invite you all for wine and food as usual to the music room. I wanted to announce that Brown finally sent out a message today that we can be without masks from Monday onwards, so you don't have to wear your mask anymore when you come back next week. And third, I wanted to thank Matthew here in the back who did the camera work tonight. And so on that note, I just thought that was such a wonderful presentation, a breath of fresh air, and
It was
apart from seeing lots of artists whom I didn't know, it was for me the most fascinating part was to hear your personal stories of interacting with these artists and all the trouble you go through and the unexpected encounters you have and so on.
it was the first time I've ever shown slides of artists I've worked with and shows I've done and not actually talked about the artwork and what it's doing. So that was a challenge for me, but I thought this would be a really different angle.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.